Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome into the Dynasty Market Watch, where yesterday's price is not today's price. I'm Todd Halverson, and this is Monday Morning Wide Receiver. Every week, I'm going to go through my revised wide receiver rankings and tiers, updating on what we just saw from the previous week. Some weeks may have some major movers. Some weeks it could be some smaller stuff. I'll try to include market values and draft capital values for each players in each of these tiers. This is going to be available on Spotify and YouTube, Apple Podcasts. If you go to YouTube, you'll get to see a visual of my tier breakdown, and hopefully that'll make for a better viewer experience. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that we have 6 tiers here that we're going to run through, and basically the top 50 wide receivers for Dynasty. So let's get to it. Monday morning wide receiver. First tier, superstar, Justin Jefferson, C.D. Lamb. If you're watching on YouTube, no, I'm not about to mention Jamar Chase. He's not in this tier. And I got to admit, this might be a bit of a small overreaction, but if I'm a contender, there is zero question that I want C.D. Lamb and Justin Jefferson over Jamar Chase. They just feel a lot more reliable at this point, and that's why I've got Jamar Chase in a tier down. Every time Jefferson and Lamb take the field, I'm preparing for them to score 20 points. And even in their bad games like yesterday, they still cracked double digits. Jefferson had a touchdown, 25% target share. The Vikings only threw the ball 24 times. I think they're going to be throwing it a lot more as they're going to be playing from behind in most games. They're not going to be playing the Giants. CeeDee Lamb had 61 through the air, 25 on the ground yesterday, had 10 targets and a 31% target share. So these guys are both mid-first-round startup players to me. And that's not to take anything away from Jamar Chase. I just think that these guys are just that little bit amount better. And if I'm a contender, I just want these two on my team. If I'm a rebuilder and I've got Jamar Chase, I'm fine with having him because I think the better days are to come for him. It's not that I think that he is bad. If I'm a contending team, I just want these guys to be that staple for my receiver room. And if you're watching here on YouTube, you can see that I've got them valued at 3 to 4 first-round picks. I'm valuing a first as what I would call just a playoff first. So a team that if I've got their first, I'm going to assume they're going to make the playoffs. That's roughly the 108, maybe the 109. I'm not saying this is a juggernaut team, but if I'm going to be trading for someone else's first, I have to assume that they're going to be trying to win. And I'm not going to just assume that that's a top 3 or 4 pick. So if I'm going to be taking someone else's first, let's just assume that it's the 108 or so. And it's going to take 3 or 4 of those for me to move off of a Justin Jefferson or a C.D. Lamb. Moving to tier 2, which we're going to call the elite tier. That's where you're going to find Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, and A.J. Brown. And I can certainly see a case for a little mini tier between Jefferson, C.D. Lamb, and then this group, which would include Jamar Chase and ARSB. I didn't want to have a bunch of tiers where it was just two here, 2 there. So we're going to clump them all together. I would rather have Jamar Chase and Amon-Ra than the next 3 guys, Garrett Wilson, Puka, and A.J. Brown. But it's not a big gap. Like the gap between those guys, if I can get a plus of maybe like a couple seconds or a second going to those guys. Now, Puka is now hurt. He's potentially out for 3 to 4 weeks. So that's something we need to monitor. But Puka outscored Jamar Chase last year. He outscored A.J. Brown last year. Obviously, he outscored Garrett Wilson. So Puka is a guy that I think would probably, you could make the case that he could be in that same little mini tier with Jamar Chase and Amon-Ra St. Brown. But A.J. Brown, I can see where someone could be a little bit squeamish of him being included in a tier that includes Jamar Chase and Amon-Ra. But he continues to score as a top 6-7 wide receiver. And so he may be the most underrated guy coming into the season. Now, after that explosion week 1 on primetime, it may not be that you can go out and buy him because in a lot of scenarios, he's on a contender and they really value him. But maybe a miss on us and a community as a whole of not going out and buying more A.J. Brown as we get into the season. With Garrett Wilson, he is the one where I could see someone saying, well, what's the deal? We haven't seen it yet. Why are we including him with this group of guys that were all top 6 or 7 wide receivers last year? I just think that he is that talented. I think that as I'm recording this, we're proceeding to walk into Monday Night Football, and we could be walking out of Monday Night Football and saying he's in that superstar tier. I think he's just that good and that talented. I think that probably by week 3 or 4, that may be where we're headed with Garrett Wilson. Now, on the flip side, he does have Aaron Rodgers, who is no spring chicken. And so what is his QB outlook for the future? That remains to be seen. But all of these guys, I'm kind of valuing them at about 3 firsts. So not a great deal less than the Jefferson CeeDee Lamb tier. They're basically end of the first of a startup, beginning of a second type. And I'd say AJ Brown's probably closer to like the mid second. So the tier 3, brink of elite, that is where we're going to find Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr. I can almost see them being valued about the same as like AJ Brown. You could say AJ Brown's in the brink of elite, but the only caveat for him is that he's a little bit older than these guys. And so he is elite from a week to week standpoint. He's just, age 27 instead of 21, 22, like Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr. Both of these guys are uber talented, but it seems like neither of them are really going to go out of their way to help your teams this season. The one catch for 4 yards from Marvin Harrison Jr., that was pretty concerning. Watching Greg Dortch catch all of these passes in the middle of the field while Marvin Harrison Jr. is just kind of running wind sprints, that's not promising. Neighbors did basically what you would hope for as like your median outcome of like a 6 for 60 type game. And I would expect probably we're going to see a lot more of that, given that he's got probably the worst quarterback situation in the NFL. So he's getting no favors done for him. And really, he's probably staring at a Garrett Wilson, Drake London outlook for the next couple of years as he tries to find a quarterback. So you've got to kind of decide, okay, do I need the points? And if so, maybe I have to move Malik Neighbors for an AJ Brown type. If I don't need the points, if I'm rebuilding, then I'm just going to wait it out and buy Neighbors age 22, 23, 24 seasons. Hopefully he's up and running to that elite level. But over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to really try to hold these guys in that brink of elite group. I don't want to cave to the idea of moving them down a tier just because we're not seeing it yet. Sometimes it takes these rookie wide receivers, it could take them 6-8 weeks. It could take them until next year. As long as we're seeing a little bit of progression with both these guys, I think that's a good thing, and I'll keep them in that brink of elite. And if they go off at any point, then they're just going to jump up a tier into that elite group. All right, so this is kind of where things start to get a little bit more fun. So we've gone through the top 9 wide receivers: Jefferson, Lamb, Chase, Amon-Ra, Garrett Wilson, Puka, AJ Brown, Neighbors, and Marvin Harrison Jr. So there's your top 9. And now we're going to move into the next tier, which I'm calling the kind of globby, but holding out hope for elite. So let me list the players, and then I'll kind of explain what all that means. So in this tier, you've got Rashee Rice, Chris Olave, Nico Collins, Drake London, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, Brandon Ayuk, George Pickens, Tank Dell, and Rome Odunze. So we've got 10 guys in this tier, and these guys could all go one way or the other. So this tier, like I said, is called kind of globby, but holding out hope for elite. And what does that mean? So if you listened to me before on the Dynasty Market Watch podcast, I talk a lot about the kind of the glob wide receivers, which have kind of moved around from like wide receivers like 15 or 20 to like wide receiver 30 range. So right now it's probably like in the 20 to 35 range. And I would call those guys the glob of wide receivers because they're not really, a lot of them are not really game changers for your week to week points per game. And at the same time, I'm pretty skeptical about their ability to get into the 2 or 3 first range of being elite in the future. And that's what I eventually want for my teams. I want 2 or 3 guys on my teams that are in that top 10 or 12 receiver range if I'm a contender. So this group, these 10 wide receivers, I would really split them half and half. So you've got 5 guys at the top, which I would consider to be Rice, Olave, Nico, London, and Waddle. Those 5 guys, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I could see them jumping into that brink of elite tier. And if things go really well, I could see them jumping into the elite tier. We just saw Nico go for over 100 yesterday. We saw Rashee Rice go for over 100. Waddle went for about 100. Like those guys really went crazy. And then you've got Olave and London, who coming into the season, I would have really put them closer to that brink of elite group with Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr. But yesterday they combined for 26 yards. So they're already fallers at this point early in the year. And I think we've got to have a little bit of concern. Cousins looked terrible with London. Cousins took one snap under center and it was a spike. So I think Cousins is bordering on cooked. And Olave was on a team that scored 47 points and he got 2 targets. Both of those are rather concerning. And the other 3 being Rice, Nico, and Waddle, all 3 performed well. It's going to take several more outings like that to move them up, but I think that they are firmly in the we're not dropping down to the glob group. We're not moving down to the T. Higgins and the DK Metcalfs of the world. The next grouping of this is the Devontae Smith, Brandon Ayuk, Pickens, Tank Dell, Rome Odunze. Pickens coming into the year, I would have had him down a tier, but he's proven really over the last year that he's worthy of being in this group. And so I've got him here. If he can hold his worth, maybe he moves into that first 5. If he kind of falters with a quarterback tandem of Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, then okay, maybe you've got to drop him back down. But for now, I think he's solidly in this Devontae Smith, Brandon Ayuk, Tank Dell, Rome Odunze group. The other one that I'd be really concerned about right now, if I'm a contender needing to use him, is Rome Odunze. I don't really see a scenario where he helps you out this season. I was not very high on him coming into the year. Somehow I finished up with 2 or 3 shares of him on my Dynasty teams out of 15 Dynasty leagues. I'm not optimistic about the way that things are going to play out for him this year. Caleb Williams seems to be someone that wants to spread it around, and I don't foresee him having any guy on his team with above a 25% target share. So it's going to be Keenan Allen. It's going to be DJ Moore. I expect even Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett to take some targets away from Odunze, and I think it's going to be kind of a long year for him. I think he's a really talented player, and that's why I think that he should be in this group for now. But he's going to have to get up into that 5-6 targets per game. Yesterday, he had 4 targets, 1 catch, and the 1 catch was on a tip ball, and then he fumbled it. So not a hot start for Rome Odunze, to say the least. Tank Dell, I think I'm probably ahead of market on him, and I think that he has the ability to remain in this group, but his situation is just a little bit tough right now. He's basically playing out of the slot, and he and Diggs are kind of sharing that role. And yesterday he had not what you would want out of a wide receiver 2 or 3, which is basically what he is on your Dynasty team if you've got him. He's in the top 24. If you're a contender, you're probably having to start him as your wide receiver 2 or 3. And I'm not sure that he's going to be able to live up to that bill for the season, given the target competition in his wide receiver room. I think there's going to be a lot of games where he is the leader, and then maybe it's Nico, then Diggs. There's going to be a lot of weeks where it was like yesterday, where it was Nico, Diggs, and then Tank Dell. So it's just going to kind of be mix and match. But for now, he's in this kind of globby, but holding out for elite. I think he's got the talent to be up to move up. But for now, we'll hold here, and at some point, we may have to consider moving him down if things do not improve. The other guy I haven't mentioned is Devontae Smith and Ayuk. I think you kind of clump them together because they're in that getting older range of 25, 26. They're not given the benefit of the doubt of being these young guys that will eventually produce. Like, they're at the age now where we need them to produce. Ayuk produced last year, but he still is in a really difficult situation from a target competition standpoint. Last year, he had extreme efficiency, and he's going to have that again in order to put up big-time wide receiver 1 numbers. So I have him on the back end of this globby tier from a talent standpoint. He's maybe one of, if not the most talented from this entire group, but we still need the fantasy points. We don't get any credit for straight-up talent. Keeping an eye on him at some point, if he's not producing to this level of last year, then we might have to move him down to that DK T group. And then also within here, we've got that are also worth about 2 firsts. You've got Tyreek Hill, and he's just a cheat code. So, I mean, from a points per game standpoint, you're looking at basically Justin Jefferson, CD Lamb level. And obviously, he's older. He's got probably 2-3 years left in the tank, but you're getting high end production. So, I don't have any Tyreek Hill. I would definitely be looking to trade him for one of these guys. I think you could probably, at this point, after a big game yesterday, pretty easily move him for a Chris Olave or a Drake London. So that's probably a move that I would be looking to make, unless it's difficult to do that if you're a high end contender. I mean, can you stomach that type of move? Um, I'm more willing to just kind of take the loss on the fantasy points per game and just assume that Olave and London can figure it out. But I think you could probably also try to make that move for maybe like a Malik Neighbors. Maybe you could add a little bit and get Marvin Harrison Jr. So I think there's some opportunities there with Tyreek Hill after that big game yesterday. Also, he restructured his or he added another year to his contract. So there's some optimism there that he can play another 2-3 years. All right, the next tier, the actual glob that we kind of have been referring to. So you've got 2 levels of what I'm calling the glob. You've got the older glob, and then you've got the younger glob. So the older glob is DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, and T. Higgins. So all 4 of these guys are in that 25, 26, 27 range, and all of them are putting up numbers that are like, all right, you're my wide receiver 3, that's fine. Or if I'm a really good team, maybe you're a flex. You're basically just getting production of like an Amari Cooper type of that we'll talk about later, but you have a little bit of youth. So a lot of the guys that we just mentioned are eventually going to find themselves in this group. Like if Devontae Smith or Brandon Ayuk aren't producing at high-end wide receiver 2 levels, and they're more like back end wide receiver 2s, then you're going to find yourself in this group of the older glob of DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, T. Higgins. And then on the younger side, you've got the young glob, which is Xavier Worthy, JSN, Brian Thomas, Zay Flowers, Lad McConkey, Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed. So all of these guys have what I would consider to be pretty high potential. And I could see them moving up into that kind of globby tier. You kind of have to squint for guys like maybe JSN, Jordan Addison. But you can see it like you saw in week 1 with Xavier Worthy. Zay Flowers had a pretty solid game, although his ADOT was extremely low. The one guy here that I am very optimistic about is Brian Thomas Jr. He only had 4 targets in that week 1 game, but they threw the ball 21 times. And only 19 of them were actually targeted passes. So he had 4 targets of their 19, and he looked really good. He caught all 4 of his balls. He had 47 yards, a touchdown. So I think that as they increase their volume, he seems to be a focal point of that offense. And Brian Thomas is a guy that I would be really interested in if I wanted to move off of a Devontae Smith or an Ayuk. Even a Waddle, move down a tier, add something. Maybe you can do add a couple seconds. Maybe you can attempt maybe like a 1-2 swap. That might be a little bit aggressive, but Brian Thomas is someone that I would be really interested in. I think there was probably some potential in his makeup that he is Quentin Johnson 2.0. That might be offensive to some, but I think that there was at least that concern after a year of Quentin Johnson, and that is definitely not the case. This guy can play, and he proved it last year, leading college football in touchdowns. He probably just got overshadowed a little bit by Malik Neighbors, and he looks like he's the real deal. So he's a guy that if I'm in the trade market for one of these guys, if I could swap a DK, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, T. Higgins, I would probably be willing just to swap them 1 for 1 and have no issue about it. A couple of the other guys within this group, Jaden Reed obviously went bananas week 1, but now he's got the Jordan Love injury to be concerned with. So something to just kind of monitor there. I would say that he's still firmly in this tier, whether Jordan Love is back or not. He had a big game, obviously, but one thing coming into the year with him is that you were potentially concerned of all the touchdowns that he was relying on. Well, he continues to score touchdowns. So maybe that's a Jordan Love thing. Maybe that's a Jaden Reed thing. He looks extremely explosive. So just the touchdowns are obviously he's relying heavily on them, but he continues to figure out ways to get into the end zone. So as long as he's doing that, even though he only caught 4 balls, he had over 100 yards receiving. I think he had a rushing touchdown. So I mean, he's putting up big numbers on limited touches. They really have to just get him the ball more, and if they do, it could be wheels up, and you may be looking at him in that grouping of that kind of globby group. And then Xavier Worthy, obviously, he had a kind of explosive burst onto the scene in week 1. He only had 2 catches. I know he had the jet sweep touchdown. Probably was more fun to watch and more fun looking at your fantasy points than it was in reality. So if I have him, I'm not looking to go out and just get rid of him by any means, but I'm definitely not out trying to buy, because I think the people that have him are just really excited about what they have on their team. So this group I've got worth between 1 and 1.5 firsts. If I'm thinking about any of these guys, DK, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, T, I'm really not selling for a singular first. I would need like a first and probably a second, or maybe even 2 seconds if they're going to be late. And then with the Worthy, JSN, Brian Thomas, Zay Flowers, Ladd McConkey, Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed, I would buy probably most of these guys for a very late first. Wouldn't make me extremely comfortable moving a first, because I'm typically trying to do something a little bit more exciting than that. I would maybe want to combine a first and something and go up and get a Chris Olave, Drake London type. But let's say I've got 3 or 4 firsts, then okay, I may be willing to burn one on a Brian Thomas if I deem it to be pretty late. So 1.5 firsts. I really don't want to turn around and take my Worthy and trade it for a future first, because I kind of have hit on that one that I drafted him with last year in that 109, 110 range. So why add some risk when I don't need to? So I would at least need a second to add on to that. And then we haven't talked about JSN. Obviously, not an encouraging start for his season. He had 2 catches in the first half, and I guess he didn't do anything in the second half. But that offense seemed to be a bit of a mess. DK was also terrible. So I'm going to just kind of sweep that one under the rug. Let's see what happens week 2. There seems to be a lot of encouraging signs from the new offensive coordinator that was from Washington. So I think we should just kind of kick that one to the side. Let's see what happens week 2. But JSN, not an encouraging start. All right, so we'll move on to the next tier, which is also kind of part of this glob range. So what we're calling the old ass potential wide receiver ones, and these guys are Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel. These guys I'm basically expecting high end wide receiver 2, low end wide receiver 1. And for Kupp, I mean, after last night, he goes get 21 targets, 14 catches. I'm expecting a potentially top 5, top 6 season out of him, especially if Puka is out for 3 to 4 weeks. He's going to go bananas the next little bit. So these guys I'm also valuing in that like first and a second range. Very similar to like the Worthy, the DK Metcalf group of the glob range. So that whole glob I would consider Kupp, Adams, Deebo to be worth about the same. So if you're a contender and you're sitting there with Jordan Addison and you wanted to move him for Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, or Deebo Samuel, I think that's a reasonable swap to make. I really don't have that much optimism in Jordan Addison in the future. Really, very few of those guys I have that much optimism in, and that's why they're in the glob. And so if I can move them for a guy like Kupp that I think is going to give me extreme points per game these next at least 4 to 5 weeks, and then probably the rest of the season, then yeah, I'm okay with that. And really, I don't want to have many of those guys in that glob, young or old range. I can understand having them on a rebuild. Like I've got Worthy on a rebuild. I've got JSN. Okay, that's fine. but I don't really see any reason to have a DK, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, T. Higgins. And I will be the first to admit I have 3 T. Higgins out of my 15 leagues, and I probably need to be shedding them. Unfortunately, he's hurt, so that's not going to be that easy. So, but I would like to get off of all of those guys. I'd rather move them for like a Brian Thomas, like I mentioned, maybe a Worthy. That may not be possible. Or can I tier up? Can I add a second? Can I add maybe a running back or something and go get a Tank Dell, a Pickens, a maybe even Drake London, Olave after that poor game. So those guys. Now, when I say poor game, DK, DJ Moore had poor games. Pittman, okay. T. Higgins obviously didn't play. So like it may not you may not be pumping the juices for the people that own Olave in London to be going and getting DK and DJ Moore. But with the old ass potential wide receiver ones, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, those guys, I think they're going to have high end seasons. And so, and I don't think this will be the end of the road for them. I think that they can do it again next year as well. Next group, we've got the empty yield producers. So these guys are really not going to return you anything in the trade market. Maybe you can get a couple seconds for them. I can about guarantee you, as I've got several teams with Calvin Ridley or Deontay Johnson or Amari Cooper, you're really not going to be able to get many teams to even be interested. And the teams that are interested, they really don't want to give you much more than just a singular second. So selling these guys is hopefully you're not in that market. But if you've got them, or if you've got them, hopefully they're producing for you. So that's why I'm calling them the empty yield producers. And that group is Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Deontay Johnson, Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, Terry McLaurin, and Keenan Allen. So from this group, yesterday we had solid outings from Godwin. We had a good game from Mike Evans. Diggs had 2 touchdowns, although his ADOT was pretty low. I mean, he had, I think he had 1 air yard total in his 6 targets because he had a negative 10-yard air yard attempt. Deontay Johnson struggled. He only had 2 catches. See, he did have 6 targets. So if Bryce Young can ever figure it out, which I'm not optimistic is going to happen, then maybe things can kind of turn around for him. But Christian Kirk struggled. Calvin Ridley with Levis, 3 catches, 50 yards. McLaurin struggled. Keenan Allen dropped a touchdown. So this group did not have a good day. Amari Cooper, obviously awful, but he did have, I think, close to 10 targets, maybe 9 targets. So maybe some better days are ahead for Amari Cooper, especially if they can get back Jedrick Willis and Jack Conklin. They're 2 tackles that were out in week 1. So these guys I've all got valued at about an early 2 or maybe 2 late seconds. And if I'm selling them, I think that's about what I would want. If I was paying for them, obviously I would prefer to just maybe give up a singular mid-second. Maybe I can give up maybe a mid-second and a third. But I think ultimately, if it really came down to it, a couple of the guys like Godwin, Diggs, Evans, Amari Cooper, I've tried to split up. If you're watching on YouTube, I've tried to split up the kind of higher end versus the lower end. So Cooper, Diggs, Godwin, Evans, and then maybe Deontay Johnson. I have a little bit more than that group of Kirk, Ridley, McLaurin, and Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen also came yesterday. Looked like he had his heel injury is recurring. So something there. Next group is the empty producers field. So I think these guys potentially return you some value in the future. And you can see this is individual Christian Watson, Jameson Williams, Keon Coleman, and then not pictured also. I would go ahead and also consider Pearsall, Josh Downs, Leggett, and Jalen Polk. So these 8 wide receivers, not really guys that you want to be putting into your flex. Definitely don't want to have them as a starter for a contender. But I think that these guys all have kind of shown that they maybe have some potential. You're probably, like me, higher on some of them than others. So like Jameson Williams or Polk, Pearsall, I feel a little bit better about than maybe Christian Watson, Josh Downs, Leggett. So it's kind of like a pick your poison here on who you like. after week 1, Jamison Williams, pretty good outing. He could be a guy that we look up and say, okay, let's move him up into that young glob tier. Same for Keon Coleman. He had roughly 6 catches, 50 yards yesterday. So solid games for them. Pearsall's obviously on the IR. Downs is hurt. Leggett, I'm not very optimistic about. Not only is he, I question him as a talent, but he's in a horrendous situation with that offense with the Panthers. And then Polk kind of in a middling situation there. A.D. Mitchell did have a few opportunities yesterday that were kind of ruined by poor throws from Anthony Richardson. So I think there may be some opportunity there. And maybe if you were maybe a owner of like a Calvin Ridley or a Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin, and you're a rebuild, and you're thinking, okay, how can I get these guys off my team? I want to have something else. I want to have some youth. A.D. Mitchell may not be a terrible move for you. Keon Coleman may be shooting a little bit too high. I don't know if you can quite get to him, but he's probably where I'd start, and then I'd move to A.D. Mitchell thereafter. Ricky Pearsall is probably about where I would settle if I had to. So that is the entire group. We're looking at about, I think, 51 total wide receivers here. And just kind of recapping, I've got Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, about 3 or 4 firsts. Like I said, these firsts, I'm just kind of considering them to be roughly the 108. I'm always going to consider a first that I'm taking from someone else if they're going to attempt to make the playoffs. And if that's the case, then you're just kind of looking at roughly the 108. So next group down, like I said at the beginning, I can see a group of Jamar Chase and ARSB moving up as a mini tier. They're probably in that three first range, though, and then Garrett Wilson, Puka, and AJ Brown. Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., about 2.5 to 3 first, a half a first being like 2 seconds, or maybe like a very late first. So if you've got maybe like 2 firsts that are playoff type, or maybe 2 mid firsts, I'd be okay. Mid first being like they might miss the playoffs. That would be okay with me, being the value for Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr. And then the group of the kind of globby, holding out for Elite, and then Tyreek Hill. Those guys I've got valued at about 2 firsts. And then moving down to the glob being worth about a first and a second. If I've got them, that's what I'd be looking to sell for. If I'm buying, I would be okay with buying. This is probably the one group where I've got the largest gap between what I'd sell for and what I'd buy for. So what I would sell for is probably the first and the second. What I'd buy for is maybe a very late first, but that's not exactly how, like I said earlier, it's not exactly how I want to be spending my coveted firsts. I want to be getting elite talents. And if I'm getting a guy in this range, I don't think that they are a super elite talent, or at least unproven to be that yet. Unless you're Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, but you're just really old. And I really don't want to be spending first on really old. You could have spent a first on Cooper Kupp last year after his first game back from injury, thinking like, oh, wow, I got an awesome player for the rest of the year. He's going to win me a championship. And then he just fell off the face of the earth at the end of the year. Same for Devontae Adams. Same for Stephon Diggs. So just a reminder that when you're burning your first, that's not my favorite way to spend it. And then the empty yield producers and the empty producers with yield, they're all kind of in that like 2 late seconds or an early second range. So thanks for joining. This was the Monday morning wide receiver. I'm going to come back here every week throughout the year. We'll continue to update this. We'll kind of see where guys are moving. Thanks for joining. See you next week.